Charleston's slave markets handled thousands of transactions every year, but only once did the city's auctioneers refuse to sell a man without written warnings attached to his bill of sale. The document, preserved in a private collection until 1987, describes a 28-year-old field hand whose previous 3 owners had all died under circumstances the Charleston Constabulary declined to investigate further. What made this man so dangerous wasn't violence or rebellion, the two things plantation society feared most. It was something the authorities couldn't name, something that made hardened slave traders cross themselves and mutter about judgment. The auction house demanded every potential buyer sign an acknowledgement that they understood the risks, though the document never specified what those risks actually were. 7 men bid on him that day. Only 1 completed the purchase. Before we continue with the story of what happened to the buyer who ignored every warning, I need you to do something important. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this one, the ones they tried to bury in courthouse basements and family archives, are what this channel is all about. And drop a comment telling me what state you're listening from. I want to know how far these forgotten American mysteries are reaching. Now, let's discover why Charleston's most experienced slave dealers called this sale the biggest mistake they ever witnessed. The transaction took place on March 14, 1843, at Ryan's Mart on Chalmers Street, one of Charleston's busiest auction houses. The building still stands today, though few tourists understand what happened within its walls. Ryan specialized in what they called prime field hands, young men with strong backs who could work dawn to dusk in the rice plantations that made the Carolina Lowcountry one of the wealthiest regions in America. March was peak buying season. Planters needed workers ready for the spring planting, and Ryan's Mart conducted auctions 3 times weekly to meet demand. The man who arrived in chains that morning bore no name in the auction catalog. The ledger listed him only as Subject 41, male, estimated 28 years, origin Virginia. This wasn't unusual. Many slaves arrived at Charleston's market stripped of names, histories, families, everything except the bodies that could be sold. But the auction clerk had added something irregular to his entry, a red ink notation that read, "Special conditions apply, see manager before bidding." Thomas Yancey stood in the back of the auction room that morning, watching the proceedings with the careful attention of a man who'd made his fortune knowing exactly what he was buying. At 46, Yancey owned Belmonte Plantation, 4,000 acres of prime rice land 20 miles north of Charleston along the Cooper River. He'd built his wealth slowly, buying smaller properties and consolidating them, earning a reputation as a careful manager who rarely lost money and never lost control of his holdings. His neighbors respected him. His workers feared him in the way they feared all masters, no more and no less. Yancey had attended Ryan's auctions for 2 decades. He could assess a man's worth in seconds, reading strength in shoulder width, endurance in calloused hands, potential problems in the eyes. He'd come that morning looking for 3 prime field hands to replace workers he'd sold off at a profit the previous season. He had not come looking for mysteries or bargains too good to be true. The morning auction proceeded normally through the first 17 lots. Men and women stood on the platform while buyers examined teeth, checked for whip scars that might indicate rebellion, asked the routine questions about age and experience. Prices ran typical for the season. Prime men were fetching between $900 and $1,200, women slightly less, children priced by potential. Then the auctioneer called Lot 18, and the atmosphere in Ryan's Mart changed. 2 handlers brought the man onto the platform, and Thomas Yancey noticed immediately that they kept their distance, standing an arm's length farther back than they did with other lots. The slave himself stood motionless at the center of the platform, his hands shackled in front of him, leg irons forcing him into a shortened stance. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and scarred hands of someone who'd worked hard labor his entire life. His face bore no expression at all, and this was what made Yancey lean forward with interest. Most men standing on auction platforms showed something in their faces: fear, resignation, Anger carefully hidden behind blank masks. Despair. This man showed nothing. His eyes moved across the crowd with the same mild interest someone might show watching clouds drift past. When the auctioneer began his pitch, the slave's gaze settled on a point somewhere above the buyers' heads and stayed there, unmoving, barely blinking. "Lot 18, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of his profession. Prime field hand, approximately 28 years of age, originating from Virginia Piedmont. Strong constitution, no visible infirmities." He paused, glancing down at his notes. "Special terms apply to this lot. All interested bidders must consult with Manager Talbot before participating in the auction." A murmur ran through the crowd. In 20 years of attending these sales, Yancey had never heard such an announcement. 3 men left their positions near the front and walked to the manager's office, a small room adjacent to the main auction floor. They returned within minutes, 2 of them shaking their heads, the third looking pale. None resumed their positions near the platform. The third man caught Yancey's eye as he passed and said quietly, "Don't do it, Thomas. Whatever price they name, it's not worth it." Yancey watched the man leave, then turned his attention back to the platform. The slave hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to the murmurs, to the bidders walking away, to anything happening around him. That stillness drew Yancey forward. He'd spent his life around enslaved men and women, had seen every form of resistance and accommodation they could devise. This was something different. He made his way to Manager Talbot's office. 3 other men waited in line ahead of him. He listened as Talbot gave each the same speech in low, urgent tones. 2 left immediately. The third, a planter Yancey knew slightly from Christchurch Parish, stayed to ask questions. "But what exactly did he do?" the planter pressed. "You're telling me 3 owners died, but you won't say how." Talbot, a thin man in his 50s whose family had run Ryan's Mart for 3 generations, spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "The documentation is incomplete. What I can tell you is that we acquired him from an estate sale in Virginia. The estate executor insisted on the special terms. He said anyone who buys this man needs to understand there are circumstances that can't be fully explained." "That's not an answer," the planter said. "It's the only answer I can give you," Talbot replied. "If you're not comfortable with uncertainty, then this lot isn't for you." The planter left. Yancey stepped forward. "Tell me everything you know," he said. Talbot studied him for a long moment, then pulled out a folder. Inside were 3 documents, a bill of sale from 1838, another from 1840, and a letter written on expensive paper with a lawyer's precise hand. His first documented owner was a man named Harrison Kemp, tobacco planter in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. Kemp bought him at a Richmond auction in 1838. 14 months later, Kemp was found dead in his tobacco barn, heart failure, according to the examining physician. Talbot tapped the first document. "The interesting part is what happened in the 3 days before Kemp died." "Go on," Yancey said. Kemp's overseer reported that Kemp had become convinced the slaves were plotting against him. He conducted interrogations, increased punishments, disrupted work schedules, searching for evidence of conspiracy. On the 3rd day of this behavior, he was found dead. No marks on him, no sign of struggle. Just dead in his barn at 43 years old, with a perfectly healthy heart according to every examination he'd had before. Yancey waited. The slave we're discussing was one of the men Kemp had interrogated most intensely. The overseer noted in his report that this particular slave had answered every question calmly, never showed fear or anger, and the morning after each interrogation session, Kemp seemed more agitated than before, more convinced of conspiracy, more certain of threats. The overseer said it was like watching Kemp argue with his own thoughts. "And you believe there's a connection?" Yancey asked. "I'm telling you what's documented," Talbot said carefully. Kemp's estate sold off his slaves to settle debts. This man went to a planter named Virgil Stowe in Halifax County. Stowe lasted 11 months. He took his own life, hanged himself in his study. His family found letters he'd written in the days before his death, pages and pages describing dreams he couldn't escape, certainties about disasters that never materialized, absolute convictions about threats from people who'd never threatened him. The room felt smaller suddenly. Yancey realized his hands had tightened on the edge of Talbot's desk. Stowe's overseer noted the same pattern Kemp's had. In the weeks before Stowe's death, he'd focused particular attention on this slave. Interrogations, isolation, special surveillance. And the more attention Stowe paid him, the worse Stowe became. The man's wife said her husband stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly, spent hours staring at nothing, talking to himself about dangers that made no sense. And the third owner? Yancey's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. A Richmond merchant named Dobbins who bought him at Stowe's estate sale, thinking to resell at profit. Dobbins owned him for 6 weeks before dying of what the physician called a stroke. Dobbins was 37 years old, no prior health concerns. In the days before his death, his business partners noted erratic behavior, unfounded accusations, paranoid decisions, conversations that seemed to continue discussions no one else had heard. Talbot closed the folder. Dobbins's executor refused to keep the man even temporarily, sent him straight to us with explicit instructions that buyers be warned. He wrote this. Talbot showed Yancey the letter. The handwriting was educated, controlled, but the final paragraph had been underlined 3 times. I cannot and will not claim this man caused these deaths. I can only state what happened. 3 owners, 3 deaths, 3 periods of escalating paranoia and fear preceding each death. If this is coincidence, it is the darkest coincidence I have witnessed in 20 years of legal practice. Yancey read the letter twice. Outside the office, he could hear the auctioneer moving through the remaining lots, his voice rising and falling in practiced rhythms. When he looked up, Talbot was watching him with an expression that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. "You're still interested," Talbot said. It wasn't a question. "I want to know what you think," Yancey said. "Off the record, do you believe there's something to this?" Talbot was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe 3 men died. I believe there's documentation of strange behavior before each death. I believe that man out there," he gestured toward the auction floor, "hasn't shown a single emotion since he arrived here. Not fear, not hope, not anger, nothing. In 30 years of working these auctions, I've never seen that. Everyone shows something. But do you believe he's dangerous? I believe you should think very carefully about what you're willing to risk to find out." Yancey returned to the auction floor as the auctioneer was preparing to close lot 18 without bids. The slave still stood in the same position, expression unchanged, eyes fixed on that point above the crowd. Yancey raised his hand. $500, he said. The auctioneer's relief was palpable. "We have 500. Do I hear 550? Silence. Every head in the auction room had turned to look at Yancey. He recognized the expressions, some pitying, some curious, some satisfied that someone else was taking the risk they'd declined. 500 going once, 500 going twice. The auctioneer's gavel came down. Sold to Mr. Thomas Yancey of Belmonte Plantation for $500. The transaction took less than an hour to complete. Yancey signed the purchase documents, including a separate acknowledgement that he'd been informed of special circumstances regarding the acquisition. Manager Talbot insisted on one final conversation before releasing the slave. "His name, as far as we know it, is Isaac," Talbot said. "He answers to it, follows instructions without resistance. According to the overseers who handled him in Virginia, he's an excellent worker, never lazy, never defiant, never causes trouble with other slaves. If you didn't know his history, you'd think you'd found the perfect purchase. But I do know his history," Yancey said. "Yes," Talbot agreed, "and that's why I'm telling you this directly. If anything strange begins to happen, if you start feeling or thinking things that seem out of character, document it, write it down, share it with someone you trust." The pattern with the previous owners was that they kept their concerns to themselves until those concerns became certainties, and by then it was too late for outside perspective to help. Yancey thanked him for the advice and arranged for transport. 2 hours later, Isaac arrived at Belmonte Plantation in the back of a wagon, still shackled, still showing no emotion whatsoever. Belmonte sprawled across 4,000 acres of low-country landscape, rice fields stretching in geometric precision toward the Cooper River, bordered by thick stands of pine and cypress. The plantation supported 67 enslaved workers housed in 2 cabin rows behind the main house. Yancey employed an overseer named Curtis Beale, a methodical man from Georgia who ran the plantation with strict routine and minimal violence. Yancey believed efficiency came from consistency, not terror, and his approach had proven profitable. He assigned Isaac to the Northfield crew under the supervision of a driver named Marcus, who'd worked at Belmonte for 15 years. Marcus had authority to organize work details and maintain order among the field hands. Yancey trusted his judgment. "Just watch him," Yancey told Marcus that first evening. "I want to know everything. How he works, how he interacts with others, what he does when he thinks no one's paying attention." Marcus studied Isaac, who stood nearby waiting for assignment to quarters. "What am I watching for exactly?" "Anything unusual." "Mr. Yancey, forgive me saying so, but that's not much help." Yancey couldn't argue with that. "Just keep close attention. Report anything that seems worth reporting." The first week passed uneventfully. Marcus reported that Isaac worked harder than most, never complained, followed every instruction immediately. He kept to himself during the brief evening hours before dark, speaking only when spoken to, eating his rations alone while other workers gathered in small social groups. This isolation concerned Marcus more than defiance would have. A man that quiet, he's either broken completely, or he's thinking thoughts he doesn't want seen, Marcus said. "I don't think Isaac's broken." "What makes you say that?" "Broken men look through you. Isaac looks at you, sees you, just doesn't react to what he sees." By the second week, Yancey noticed he was thinking about Isaac more than any single slave should occupy an owner's attention. He found himself watching the north fields from his study window, trying to pick out Isaac's figure among the workers. He caught himself lying awake some nights, wondering what thoughts moved behind that expressionless face. The wondering irritated him. He had a plantation to run, business correspondence to maintain, social obligations to fulfill. One slave, even one with unusual history, shouldn't command this much mental space. But he couldn't stop. The third week brought the first incident. Marcus reported that 2 field hands had gotten into a fight, something about one man taking another's food rations. Curtis Beale, the overseer, had separated them and assigned punishment detail. Nothing unusual except for one detail Marcus mentioned almost as an afterthought. Both men claimed Isaac had been watching them in the days before the fight, just watching with that same blank expression, and it had gotten under their skin, made them jumpy and irritable. "They're blaming him for their own poor discipline," Beale said when Yancey asked about it. "Men will blame anyone rather than take responsibility." "Maybe," Yancey said. "But let's move Isaac to a different crew, put him with the river team working the south fields." The transfer happened the next day. Isaac moved to new quarters, new work assignments, new social dynamics. Yancey told himself this would prove things one way or another. Either the problems would follow Isaac, or they wouldn't. They followed. The river team's supervisor reported tension within the group. Nothing he could identify specifically, just an atmosphere of unease that hadn't existed before. Workers snapping at each other over minor issues, routines disrupted by unexplained anxiety. When pressed for details, the supervisor admitted that several workers had complained about Isaac's silence, his lack of reaction to anything around him. It made them nervous, they said. Made them feel watched, even when they weren't being watched. "Superstitious nonsense," Beale declared. "These people work themselves up over nothing." But Yancey remembered what Talbot had told him. If you start feeling or thinking things that seem out of character, document it. He began keeping a journal, noting every incident, every complaint, every moment when Isaac's presence seemed to correlate with disruption. The fourth week ended with Yancey's first nightmare. He dreamed he was standing in his rice fields at dawn, watching his workers move through their routines. Everything appeared normal until he realized none of them were actually working. They were going through the motions, pantomiming labor while their eyes stayed fixed on something behind him. He turned and saw Isaac standing at the edge of the field, perfectly still, watching him with that blank expression. And suddenly, Yancey understood that everything was wrong, that his entire life had been leading to this moment, that danger surrounded him from every direction, though he couldn't name what form that danger would take. He woke, gasping, heart hammering, dawn light creeping through his bedroom windows. The dream faded as dreams do, leaving only residual unease. By breakfast time, he'd dismissed it as the product of stress and poor sleep. But that night brought another dream, similar but different, and the night after that, another. A month after purchasing Isaac, Thomas Yancey found himself standing at his study window at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, watching the slave quarters in the distance and wondering what was happening to him. The dreams had become nightly occurrences. During the day, he caught himself losing focus during conversations, his mind drifting to vague worries he couldn't articulate. His wife commented that he seemed distracted. His overseer asked if he was feeling well. And through it all, Isaac worked in the fields, silent and expressionless, causing no direct problems while somehow being present in every problem that arose. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Yancey's journal entries from April and May 1843 reveal a man trying desperately to maintain rational perspective, while watching his own thoughts become increasingly unreliable. The entries started brief and factual. April 12th. Isaac continues steady work. No complaints from supervisors. Workers report continued unease in his presence. Cannot determine if this is genuine concern or social contagion. By late April, the entries had changed. April 28th. Another night of dreams I cannot clearly recall upon waking. Certainty of threat without source. Wife asked 3 times during breakfast if I was feeling well. Told her yes, but noticed my hands shaking while holding coffee cup. Spent morning going through account books, found myself reading same page repeatedly without comprehension. Went to fields to observe workers. When I saw Isaac, felt immediate sense that he was waiting for something. What? Cannot say. But the certainty was absolute. The change in Yancey's behavior didn't go unnoticed. Curtis Beale mentioned it to Marcus one evening in early May, unaware that Marcus was keeping his own observations. Beale said Mr. Yancey had ridden out to the south fields 3 times that day, always positioning himself where he could watch Isaac work. Each time he'd stayed perhaps 10 minutes, saying nothing, just watching. Then he'd ridden back to the main house without explanation. Man's torturing himself over something, Beale said, and I think we both know what. Marcus didn't respond directly. Instead he said, "You notice anything different about Isaac since he got here?" "Not a damn thing. He works, he eats, he sleeps, doesn't cause trouble, doesn't make friends, just exists." "Exactly," Marcus said. "In 2 months I haven't seen him smile, frown, get angry, show fear, nothing. You ever known anyone who shows nothing? Some folks are quiet. Quiet isn't the same as empty. I've been watching him close, like Mr. Yancey asked. It's like looking at someone who's only partly here. The body works, the mind works, but something else is missing." Beale shifted uncomfortably. "You saying there's something unnatural about him?" "I'm saying I don't know what I'm saying, but I know Mr. Yancey's changing, getting more worried, more focused on Isaac specifically. And I remember what Mr. Yancey told me when Isaac first arrived. Watch for anything unusual. Well, I'm watching, and what I see is Mr. Yancey turning into someone different." That conversation happened on May 8th. On May 10th, Yancey called his overseer and lead driver to his study and announced he was selling Isaac. "I've made inquiries," Yancey said. "There's a trader in Savannah who handles difficult cases. He's agreed to take Isaac off our hands for $300. Beale and Marcus exchanged glances. 300 was a significant loss on the 500 Yancey had paid just 2 months earlier. Might I ask why, sir? Beale said carefully. Because he's disrupting plantation operations. With respect, sir, he hasn't disrupted anything directly. The work gets done. The harvest projections remain on schedule. He's disrupting operations, Yancey repeated, his voice sharper than Beale had ever heard it. I'm not asking your opinion on the decision. I'm informing you it's been made. The trader arrives next week. After Beale left, Marcus remained. Yancey looked at him with exhausted eyes and said, You think I'm making a mistake? I think you're afraid, Mr. Yancey. And in all the years I've known you, I've never seen you afraid of anything. Then you're seeing it now. Yancey stood and walked to his window. The field stretched green and productive under spring sunshine. Everything looked exactly as it should. I can't explain what's happening to me, Marcus. I lie awake, convinced something terrible is about to occur. I see threats in every shadow, danger in every routine moment. I find myself suspicious of my own wife, my own overseer, people I've trusted for years. And the only common element in all of this, the only thing that's changed, is him. Maybe that's the point, Marcus said quietly. Yancey turned. What do you mean? Maybe the threat isn't what he does. Maybe it's what we do to ourselves when we're afraid of what he might do. The observation struck Yancey silent. He stood at the window for a long moment, then said, Get out, Marcus. Sir, I didn't mean, get out. Marcus left. Yancey remained at the window until long after dark, watching the slave quarters, watching for movement that never came, imagining 1,000 scenarios that made perfect sense in his frightened mind and no sense at all in the rational corner of his thoughts that still functioned. The Savannah trader arrived on May 17th. His name was Rufus Tate, and he specialized in what he called specialty acquisitions, slaves with complications that made them difficult to sell through normal channels. He examined Isaac thoroughly, checked his teeth and muscle tone, asked questions about his work history and behavior. Through all of this, Isaac stood with his usual blank expression, answering when spoken to, showing nothing. Seems like good stock to me, Tate said. Why exactly are you selling him at a loss? Yancey had prepared an answer. He's causing social disruption among my other workers. Nothing I can prove in court, but enough that I'd rather cut my losses than deal with continued problems. Tate studied him, then glanced at Isaac, then back at Yancey. You sure that's all it is? What else would it be? I deal with desperate men all the time, Mr. Yancey. Men who need to unload slaves for reasons they can't quite explain. You've got that same look. Like you're not just selling him, you're trying to get rid of something that scares you. $300, Yancey said. Take him or leave him. Tate took him. The transaction completed within the hour. Yancey watched from his study window as Tate loaded Isaac into his wagon, the slave moving with the same calm compliance he'd shown every day at Belmonte. No resistance, no emotion, no acknowledgement that his circumstances had changed again. The wagon rolled down the plantation road and disappeared into the pine trees. Yancey felt relief so intense it made him dizzy. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept without nightmares. The relief lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, Yancey received a letter from Savannah. It had been delivered by a private courier who waited while Yancey read it, then departed immediately without waiting for a response. The letter was from Rufus Tate, but the handwriting was barely recognizable as the confident script Tate had used to sign Isaac's bill of sale. Mr. Yancey, the letter began, I am returning Isaac to you at no charge. I cannot keep him. I will not keep him. What follows is an account of the last 3 days, written as clearly as my shaking hands will allow. I left your plantation believing I'd acquired a prime slave at an excellent price. My intention was to hold him a few weeks, let any difficulties calm, then resell at profit in the Savannah market. I placed him in temporary quarters with 3 other acquisitions, all men of similar age and condition. The first night, I woke at 2 a.m., convinced someone had broken into my house. I searched every room, found nothing, couldn't shake the certainty of intrusion. I stood in my hallway for an hour, listening to creaks that are always there, but suddenly sounded like footsteps. I knew I was being irrational, knew my house was secure, but the certainty of danger wouldn't release me. The second night, I didn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw scenarios of disaster, fire, flood, financial ruin, attacks from people who'd never threatened me. I got out of bed and walked my property, checking locks, examining shadows, finding nothing wrong, but unable to convince myself everything was safe. This morning, I went to the quarters to check on my acquisitions. The other 3 men were huddled in one corner, as far from Isaac as the space allowed. They said he'd been staring at the wall all night, not sleeping, just standing there staring at nothing. They said it was like being locked in a room with something that only looked human. I spoke to Isaac, asked if he was well. He turned those empty eyes on me and said, "Yes, sir, I'm well." "Okay." And in that moment, I understood what you were afraid of, Mr. Yancey. It's not what he does. It's what happens to us when we try to understand what he is. I am sending him back. My man will deliver him to your gate. I don't want payment, don't want anything except to never see him again. Do what you will with him, but for the love of God, don't sell him to anyone you care about. Whatever is wrong with this man, it spreads like disease, and I will not be responsible for passing it to another human being. Yours in desperation, Rufus Tate. Yancey read the letter 3 times, hands trembling by the end. He walked to his window and saw, already visible on the road, a wagon approaching from the south. Even at this distance, he could see the driver moving the horses faster than advisable, could see someone sitting motionless in the wagon bed. Isaac was coming back. Curtis Beale found Yancey still standing at the window when the wagon arrived. "Sir, there's a situation. The Savannah trader has returned Isaac. He's refusing payment, says he can't keep him." "What should I—" "Put him in the isolation shed," Yancey said, his voice flat. "Lock him in. No contact with other workers. I need time to think. Sir, with respect, the isolation shed is for punishment. Isaac hasn't actually done anything. Do it." The isolation shed was a small building 50 yards from the main slave quarters, used occasionally when someone required separation from the general population. It had a dirt floor, no windows, a door that locked from outside. Water and basic rations were provided twice daily. No slaves stayed there long. It was too close to torture for Yancey's usual management style. Isaac was locked inside. He went without resistance, just as he did everything without resistance. Marcus supervised the transfer and reported that Isaac had shown no emotion, no concern, no reaction at all to his new circumstances. "It's like locking up furniture," Marcus said. "I don't think he cares where he is or what happens to him." That night, Yancey sat in his study with Tate's letter spread before him and his own journal open to a blank page. He needed to think clearly, needed to document what was happening with precision rather than panic. He began writing. May 23, 1843. I have owned Isaac for 73 days. In that time, 3 separate people have reported severe anxiety and paranoid thoughts in his presence. Myself, my lead driver Marcus, and now Rufus Tate, an experienced trader who deals regularly with difficult slaves. The pattern is consistent. Proximity to Isaac correlates with increasing fear, disrupted sleep, and obsessive thoughts about threats that cannot be rationally justified. The question before me: is this man causing these effects, or are we causing them in ourselves because of knowledge about his history? Evidence for causation. 3 previous owners died. Multiple supervisors and handlers report the same psychological patterns. The effects begin only after acquisition and end only after separation. Evidence against causation. Isaac has never threatened anyone, never acted violently, never done anything except work as instructed. Every problem has occurred in the minds of observers, not in objective reality. If we were ignorant of his history, would we notice anything unusual? But we are not ignorant, and that knowledge changes everything. Current state: Isaac is locked in isolation. I feel relief at his confinement, which itself troubles me. What am I afraid of? A man who stands silently, a worker who follows every instruction? Or am I afraid of my own thoughts, the ones that suggest impossible dangers and unavoidable disasters? I cannot sell him again. That's clear. No trader will accept him after Tate's experience. I cannot keep him in isolation indefinitely. That's inhumane and ultimately impractical. I cannot integrate him back into plantation operations because his presence causes psychological disruption, whether that disruption is his fault or ours. What options remain? Yancey stopped writing. His hand had begun shaking again. Outside, night had fallen completely. The plantation was quiet except for normal sounds. Insects, distant animal calls, wind in the pines. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was perfectly safe. So why did he feel like a man awaiting execution? The answer came to Yancey 3 days later, though not from any rational deliberation. It came in the form of a conversation he overheard between Curtis Beale and a field hand named Samuel, a man who'd worked at Belmonte since Yancey's father owned the place. They were standing near the main house, unaware Yancey could hear them through an open window. Samuel was speaking, his voice carrying the careful authority of age and experience. You want to know what I think? I think that man in the shed is showing y'all what you already are. Masters spend every day afraid of us. Afraid we'll rebel. Afraid we'll run. Afraid we'll poison your food or burn your houses or kill you in your sleep. You live in fear and call it caution. You live in suspicion and call it wisdom. Then along comes someone who doesn't do nothing, doesn't threaten nothing, just exists in his own silence, and suddenly you can't handle it. Because he makes you see your own fear, makes you recognize what you've been feeling all along. That's foolish talk, Beale said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Mr. Yancey, he's a good master as masters go. Fair, controlled, thinks things through. But he bought Isaac knowing something was wrong, and now he can't stop thinking about what might happen. Not what is happening, what might happen. That's not Isaac's doing, that's Mr. Yancey doing it to himself. Yancey stood frozen at the window, feeling the words settle into his understanding like stones dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward, touching everything he'd experienced, everything he'd feared, everything he'd documented in his journal. Samuel was right. The insight arrived with devastating clarity. Isaac hadn't threatened him. Isaac had never threatened anyone. He'd simply existed with perfect silence, perfect compliance, perfect emptiness, and in that void, every observer had poured their own fears. The isolation, the blank expression, the lack of emotional response. These things hadn't caused paranoia. They'd been mirrors reflecting back the paranoia that already existed in every plantation owner's mind. Harrison Kemp, Isaac's first owner, had convinced himself of slave conspiracies and interrogated Isaac until his own imagination killed him. Virgil Stowe had dreamed disasters and threats until he hanged himself, escaping terrors that existed only in his thoughts. The merchant Dobbins had destroyed himself with suspicions that had no basis in reality. And now Yancey was following the same path, building elaborate fears around a man who'd done nothing except be incomprehensibly silent. The realization should have brought relief. Understanding should have freed him from the cycle. But instead, Yancey felt something darker settle into his chest. Because if Samuel was right, if Isaac was just a mirror, then what did it mean that 3 men had died looking into that mirror? What did it reveal about the nature of slavery itself, about the psychology of ownership, about the fear that undergirded every moment of plantation life? He descended the stairs and walked outside, finding Samuel and Beale still conversing near the equipment shed. Both men startled when they saw him approach, Beale's face going pale as he realized his employer might have overheard their discussion. "Samuel," Yancey said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "You've been at Belmonte longer than I've owned it. You knew my father, you've seen 3 generations of this family. I want you to tell me honestly, have you ever seen anyone like Isaac before?" Samuel hesitated, glancing at Beale, who gave a small nod of permission. "Not exactly like him, no sir. But I've seen men go quiet in different ways. Some break under the weight and go silent because there's nothing left to say. Others hold their silence like a weapon, refusing to give masters what they want. Isaac's different, though. He's not broken and he's not fighting. He's just absent, like he removed himself from the whole situation. And you think that absence is what frightens people? I think people need reactions, Mr. Yancey. Need to see fear or anger or submission, something that confirms the power structure makes sense. Isaac doesn't give that confirmation. He exists outside the whole framework. That's what I think troubles you. Not that he might do something, but that he won't do anything, won't participate in the performance everyone else is locked into." Yancey absorbed this, feeling each word land with uncomfortable accuracy. "The men who owned him before me, they all died. How do you explain that if Isaac didn't do anything?" Samuel chose his words carefully. "I can't speak to those men's minds, sir, but I know fear can kill as sure as poison. A man who convinces himself danger is everywhere, who stops sleeping, stops eating right, works himself into a state of constant terror, that man's going to sicken. Going to make mistakes, going to perhaps take his own life rather than live with fear he can't escape." Maybe Isaac didn't kill them. Maybe they killed themselves trying to solve a problem that didn't exist. The conversation ended there, but it echoed in Yancey's mind through the rest of that day and into the night. He returned to his study and pulled out his journal, reading through months of entries with fresh perspective. Every page confirmed what Samuel had described. Escalating fear without concrete cause. Obsessive focus on potential threats rather than actual problems. Sleep disrupted by nightmares that dissolved upon waking. Certainty of danger without ability to specify what form that danger would take. He documented his own descent into paranoia with meticulous precision, never recognizing it for what it was until an enslaved man explained it to him in terms he couldn't refute. The irony was almost unbearable. He'd feared Isaac's influence while Isaac had done nothing at all. He'd sought rational explanations for irrational feelings, never acknowledging that the irrationality itself was the point. Slavery created fear in everyone it touched, enslaved and enslaver alike, but masters could usually hide that fear behind power, control, authority. Isaac's silence had stripped away those comfortable concealment strategies, leaving the fear naked and undeniable. And what did it mean that Yancey, despite understanding this, still felt afraid? He walked to his study, pulled out a piece of paper, and began writing. The letter took 3 hours to compose, each sentence crafted and reconsidered multiple times. When finished, it read, "To the Charleston Constabulary. I am writing to report concerns regarding a slave named Isaac, currently held on my property. This man was purchased from Ryan's Mart on March 14, 1843, with documented history of association with the deaths of 3 previous owners. Since his arrival at Belmonte Plantation, I have experienced severe psychological distress, including persistent anxiety, paranoid thoughts, and obsessive fears regarding his presence. These symptoms have been corroborated by multiple observers. I believe this man represents a unique danger to public safety, though I cannot articulate the precise nature of that danger. What I can state with certainty is that proximity to him creates psychological conditions that may result in self-harm or impaired judgment. I request that the constabulary investigate this matter and determine appropriate action. I further state that I am of sound mind as I write this, which I believe my reputation and business success can verify. If anyone questions my rationality in making this report, I ask that they consider, would a man in the grip of paranoid delusion invite official scrutiny of his own mental state? I recognize the unusual nature of this complaint. I recognize it may sound like the ravings of a man who has lost his reason. I can only say that I have spent 3 months observing and documenting patterns that 3 previous owners also observed before their deaths. Whether Isaac causes these patterns or whether knowledge of his history creates them, I cannot determine. But the patterns exist, they are consistent, and they are dangerous. Yours sincerely, Thomas Yancey, Belmonte Plantation, Cooper River, South Carolina. The letter reached Charleston on May 28th. 3 days later, Deputy Constable James Wilcox arrived at Belmonte with instructions to interview all relevant parties and submit a report. Wilcox was a practical man in his late 40s, skeptical of dramatic claims but thorough in his investigations. He'd handled everything from murder cases to property disputes, and he approached Yancey's complaint with professional curiosity rather than immediate dismissal. He spent 2 days at the plantation, speaking with Yancey, Curtis Beale, Marcus, and several field hands. He examined Isaac through the locked door of the isolation shed, noting his silence and blank expression. He reviewed the documentation from Virginia, Tate's letter, and Yancey's journal entries, reading each page with careful attention. On his second evening at Belmonte, Wilcox requested a private conversation with Yancey. They sat in the study as dusk settled over the plantation, the room growing darker until Yancey lit lamps against the encroaching night. "Mr. Yancey," Wilcox began, "I've conducted many investigations in my career. I've seen men lie, seen them exaggerate, seen them create elaborate fictions to serve their purposes. I don't believe you're doing any of those things. I believe you're genuinely frightened, and I believe your fear is sincere. But I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer with complete honesty." "Go ahead," Yancey said. "Has Isaac ever threatened you? Has he ever made any gesture, spoken any word, done anything whatsoever that a reasonable person would interpret as dangerous?" Yancey opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He sat silent for a long moment before saying, "No, he has not." Has he shirked work, caused problems with other slaves, attempted escape, or engaged in any behavior that would justify punishment or special scrutiny?" "No." "Then what exactly are you afraid of?" The question hung in the air between them. Yancey struggled to articulate something he'd never successfully put into words. "I'm afraid of what I become when he's near. I'm afraid of the thoughts that seem so certain and so baseless simultaneously. I'm afraid that I'm following the same path as 3 men who died, and I don't know how to step off that path." Wilcox nodded slowly. "I spoke with your man Samuel this morning. He said something interesting. He said that Isaac's only crime is refusing to play the role slavery demands, that his silence makes the whole system visible in ways it usually isn't, and that visibility is what frightens masters. Do you think there's truth in that observation?" "I think," Yancey said carefully, "that Samuel is wiser than I've given him credit for. Then perhaps the solution isn't legal action against Isaac. Perhaps it's something else entirely." Wilcox's report, preserved in Charleston court records, makes fascinating reading. "I have completed my investigation into the concerns raised by Mr. Thomas Yancey regarding a slave known as Isaac. My findings are as follows. The documented facts are not in dispute. 3 previous owners died under unusual circumstances. Multiple observers report psychological distress in Isaac's presence. The slave himself shows no normal emotional responses and maintains constant silence except when directly addressed. However, I can find no evidence that Isaac has committed any crime or violated any statute. He has not threatened violence, has not engaged in rebellion, has not attempted escape, and has not acted in any way that would justify legal action. The deaths of his previous owners, while troubling in their coincidence, were ruled natural or self-inflicted by local authorities and do not implicate Isaac in criminal activity. Regarding the psychological effects reported by Mr. Yancey and others, I cannot determine whether these are caused by Isaac or by knowledge of his history creating self-fulfilling prophecy. What I can state is that Mr. Yancey appears genuinely distressed, and his fears, while possibly irrational, are sincerely held. I observed Isaac personally for approximately 1 hour, speaking with him and watching his demeanor. He is polite, responsive to questions, and shows no signs of mental deficiency or dangerous inclination. His silence and lack of emotional expression are unusual but not illegal. If anything, his behavior suggests someone who has withdrawn from engagement rather than someone planning harm. My recommendation is that the Charleston Constabulary take no action regarding Isaac himself, as no crime has been committed. However, I suggest Mr. Yancey consider transferring Isaac to state custody for assignment to public works projects where close oversight by a single owner is not required. This would remove the problematic dynamic while not punishing Isaac for circumstances beyond his control. The broader question raised by this case, whether a man can be dangerous through no action of his own, merely by reflecting back the fears of those who own him, is philosophical rather than legal, and therefore outside my purview. I leave it to wiser men than myself to determine what it means when a slave's greatest threat is his silence. Wilcox delivered the report personally, sitting in Yancey's study while the plantation owner read it twice. When Yancey looked up, his face had aged 10 years. "So you're saying there's nothing to be done?" Yancey said. "I'm saying the law can't help you with this, Mr. Yancey. This isn't a legal problem, it's a human problem. What's the difference?" Wilcox stood to leave. At the door he paused and said, "You could free him. Just draw up the papers and be done with it." "Free him so he can do this to someone else? Or maybe so you can stop doing it to yourself?" Wilcox touched his hat brim. "Good day, Mr. Yancey. I hope you find the peace you're looking for." Thomas Yancey sat in his study for a long time after Wilcox departed, the deputy's words echoing in the silent room. Free him. The suggestion seemed absurd. Slaves weren't freed because they made their owners uncomfortable. Manumission required compelling reasons. Exceptional service, repayment of debts, genuine affection built over decades. Not fear. Never fear. But Yancey had spent 3 months watching his own mind betray him, had documented every slide into paranoia, had recognized the pattern Samuel described. He'd seen himself becoming the same kind of man who'd owned Isaac before. Obsessive, anxious, controlled by fears he couldn't name. And he understood finally that Isaac was not the cause. Isaac was the catalyst, the blank surface that revealed what already existed underneath. The insight brought no comfort, because if Isaac was just a mirror, then what Yancey saw reflected was the fundamental truth of his entire life. That he lived in constant fear of the people he enslaved, that every interaction was colored by awareness of potential rebellion, that the whole system depended on maintaining control through force and surveillance, and the certainty of punishment. He'd never articulated this fear before because it was so constant it had become invisible, like breathing, like gravity, just the way things were. Isaac had made it visible, and once visible, it couldn't be unseen. That night, Yancey walked out to the isolation shed for the first time since Isaac had been confined there. He stood outside the locked door for several minutes, listening to the silence within, trying to gather courage for what he knew he needed to do. Finally, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Isaac sat against the far wall, his posture suggesting he'd been in that exact position for hours. When light from Yancey's lantern fell across his face, he looked up with that same blank expression, those same empty eyes that had troubled so many observers. "Isaac," Yancey said, his voice unsteady, "I need to understand something. The men who owned you before me, they all died. The trader who tried to resell you, he couldn't bear to keep you even for profit. Now I'm standing here having spent 3 months descending into fears I can't rationally justify. Did you do something to us? Is there something you're doing that I can't see?" Isaac's expression didn't change. He sat silent for a long moment, and Yancey thought he might not answer at all. Then, in that flat tone that carried no emotion whatsoever, Isaac said, "I worked for Mr. Kemp. I answered his questions. I followed his instructions. When he died, I was sold. I worked for Mr. Stowe. I answered his questions. I followed his instructions. When he died, I was sold. I worked for Mr. Dobbins. When he died, I was sold. I work for you. I answer questions. I follow instructions. This is all I have done, sir. But you see the pattern," Yancey pressed. "You see that everyone who owns you becomes frightened, becomes paranoid, sometimes dies. You must see that." I see that men who own other men are often frightened, Isaac said. I see that some cannot live with what frightens them. What causes their fear, I cannot say. I only know it is not caused by anything I do, because I do nothing except what I am told. Then what are you? Why are you different from other slaves? For the first time since Yancey had known him, something flickered across Isaac's face. Not quite emotion, but perhaps the ghost of something that had once been emotion, worn away by years of whatever experience had created this profound absence. I stopped pretending, sir, Isaac said quietly. I stopped performing the role masters want. I stopped showing fear to make them feel powerful, stopped showing gratitude to make them feel generous, stopped showing hope to make them feel merciful. I stopped all of it. I just work and exist, nothing more. Apparently that is the most dangerous thing a slave can do. The words struck Yancey like physical blows. He gripped the lantern tighter, its light wavering across the shed's walls. You're saying this is deliberate. You're choosing to be this way. I'm choosing to be honest, sir, to stop lying with my face and my voice about what this life is. If that honesty frightens people, perhaps it's because they need the lie to feel comfortable with the truth. Yancey stood frozen, recognizing in that moment exactly what Samuel had described. Isaac hadn't done anything to him or to the previous owners. He'd simply refused to perform the emotional labor that made slavery bearable for masters. The constant reassurance that the system was natural, inevitable, perhaps even beneficial. Without that performance, masters faced the raw reality of what they were doing. Owning human beings who had no choice but to comply, building wealth on forced labor, living every day with people who had every reason to hate them. That reality was unbearable. 3 men had died rather than face it. Yancey was standing at the same precipice. He left the shed without another word, locked the door behind him, and walked back to the main house through darkness that felt suddenly oppressive. His wife was already asleep. He sat in his study with a bottle of whiskey and his journal, trying to find words for what he now understood, but knowing that some truths resist articulation. The next morning, June 8, 1843, Thomas Yancey summoned his lawyer to Belmonte and instructed him to draw up manumission papers for Isaac. The lawyer, a Charleston man named Hayward, who'd handled Yancey family legal matters for 2 decades, was surprised. "May I ask the reason for this unusual decision?" Hayward inquired. "You may ask," Yancey said, "but I doubt you'll understand the answer. Let's simply say that keeping this man enslaved has proven more costly than freeing him." The paperwork took 3 days to complete. Manumission in South Carolina required documentation, justification, and registration with local authorities. Yancey provided a statement claiming Isaac had rendered exceptional service and that his freedom was earned through exemplary conduct. Both statements were technically false, but they satisfied legal requirements. On June 11th, Yancey signed the papers providing Isaac with $20 and documentation of free status. The manumission was recorded at Charleston Courthouse that same day. Under South Carolina law, Isaac had 90 days to leave the state or face re-enslavement. Yancey released him from the isolation shed personally, handing him the papers and the money without ceremony. Isaac emerged after 3 weeks of confinement looking exactly the same. Clean, healthy, expression blank, eyes revealing nothing. "You're free," Yancey said. "You understand what that means?" "Yes, sir," Isaac said. His voice, as always, carried no emotion. "I don't know what you are," Yancey continued, needing to say it even though he knew he'd get no meaningful response. "I don't know if you did something to me and the others, or if we did it to ourselves, but I can't live with not knowing, so I'm ending it the only way I can." Isaac studied him with those empty eyes. For a long moment, Yancey thought he might finally see some reaction, some flicker of triumph or satisfaction, or even simple recognition. But Isaac's face remained blank. When he spoke, it was in the same flat tone he always used. "Thank you for my freedom, sir. May I ask one question before I leave?" Yancey nodded, surprised by the request. "Do you think you'll sleep better now?" The question cut deeper than any accusation could have. Yancey had no answer. Isaac seemed to expect none. He turned and walked down the plantation road, the manumission papers folded carefully in one hand, the $20 in the other. Yancey watched from his study window until Isaac disappeared into the pine trees. A free man walking south toward Charleston, and whatever life awaited him beyond 90 days. The nightmares stopped that night. The obsessive thoughts faded over the following week. Within a month, Yancey felt almost like himself again, though something fundamental had shifted. He ran his plantation with the same efficiency as before, but he found himself questioning things he'd never questioned before. Why did certain slaves avoid his gaze? What thoughts moved behind their careful expressions? How much fear did they carry every day, and how much of that fear shaped everything about the world they inhabited? Curtis Beale noticed the change and mentioned it to Marcus one evening as they reviewed the next day's work assignments. Mr. Yancey's different since that business with Isaac. Quieter, asks more questions, actually listens to answers. Yesterday he asked me if I thought the workers were content. I didn't know what to tell him. Marcus, who'd watched the entire situation unfold with careful attention, nodded slowly. Maybe that was the point. Maybe Isaac wasn't dangerous at all. Maybe he was just the first completely honest thing any of us had ever seen in this place. No performance, no accommodation, no careful navigation of power dynamics, just silence. And we couldn't handle it, because it made us see everything else we'd been pretending not to notice. That's a heavy thought, Beale said. It's a heavy truth, Marcus replied. Mr. Yancey saw that truth, and it nearly killed him like it killed the others. Difference is he found a way to step back from it. Freeing Isaac was like closing a book he couldn't bear to keep reading. You think Isaac planned all this? Knew what effect his silence would have? I think Isaac survived the only way he could, by removing himself from the whole performance. Whether he knew what that would do to his owners, I can't say. But I know this. 3 men are dead. 1 man nearly joined them, and all because they couldn't handle a slave who refused to pretend. That tells you something about the system, doesn't it? Records show Isaac appeared in Charleston on June 15th, presenting his manumission papers to the Port Authority. He purchased passage on a ship bound for Boston, one of the few cities where free blacks could live with relative safety. A crew manifest lists him as Isaac Freedman, age approx. 28, destination Massachusetts. That's the last definitive documentation of his existence. But there are other records, scattered and unverified, that suggest his story didn't end in Boston. In 1847, a Charleston newspaper published a brief article about a free black man in Philadelphia who'd been accused of causing psychological distress to his employer, though no charges were filed. The article noted that the man's disturbing silence and refusal to display normal emotional responses had created an atmosphere of unease in the household where he worked. The employer had dismissed him without cause, providing extra wages simply to ensure his departure. In 1851, a letter published in the Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper, described a freedman in New York whose profound silence and impenetrable demeanor troubled those around him, though he committed no wrong and performed all tasks with precision. The letter's author, a white abolitionist, wrote, "This man's crime appears to be his refusal to reassure us with his manner. He works silently, lives privately, and offers nothing of himself beyond labor. We claim to want free black citizens, but when faced with one who will not perform gratitude or accommodation, we find ourselves uncomfortable. Perhaps this discomfort reveals more about our limitations than about his character." In 1856, a diary kept by a Quaker merchant in Philadelphia mentioned employing a man who'd been enslaved in Virginia and who spoke rarely but worked with extraordinary consistency. The diary entry noted, "He told me once that freedom meant the space between what others fear and what actually exists. I did not fully comprehend his meaning at the time, but reflecting upon it now, I believe he was describing the terrible gap between perception and reality that slavery creates in all minds it touches. None of these accounts can be definitively connected to Isaac. The name was common among freedmen, and the descriptions could fit many individuals navigating the complex social landscape of antebellum America. but they suggest a pattern. A man moving through free society carrying the same mirror he'd carried through slavery, showing people their own fears, their own prejudices, their own desperate need to control what they couldn't understand. And perhaps in freedom, finding spaces where his silence was simply silence rather than threat. Thomas Yancey lived until 1869, managing Belmonte Plantation through the Civil War and into Reconstruction. The war brought its own disruptions: Union blockades, Confederate conscription of laborers, eventual emancipation of everyone he'd once owned. Yancey adapted as many planters did, transitioning to sharecropping arrangements and wage labor, though his heart was never truly in the rebuilding process. His later journals, preserved by his descendants and eventually donated to the South Carolina Historical Society, show a man grappling with the morality of slavery in ways few planters did during that period. He wrote extensively about fear, control, and the psychological costs of ownership. In an entry from 1862, as Confederate armies struggled against Union forces and the certainty of slavery's permanence began to crumble, he reflected on his experience with Isaac. "I have spent 19 years trying to understand what happened in the spring of 1843. I am no closer to answers. What I know is this: I freed one man, and in doing so, saw clearly for the first time the prison I'd built for myself. Every person I enslaved was a weight on my conscience, but Isaac was the one whose silence made me feel that weight fully, not through accusation or rebellion, but through simple existence unmarked by the performances we demanded of enslaved people. I think now that Isaac's danger was his refusal to pretend. He would not smile when we wanted comfort, would not show fear when we wanted compliance, would not perform the role slavery demanded. And in that refusal, he revealed the terror at the heart of the system, that it depends entirely on performance, on both sides maintaining the illusion of naturalness. Remove that performance, show the raw reality of power without accommodation, and the whole structure becomes visible in its cruelty. 3 men died looking at that truth. I nearly became the 4th. I wonder how many others encountered Isaac in his freedom and faced the same mirror. I wonder if anyone ever learned to look without fear. As I write this, our whole society is dying. The war has revealed what Isaac revealed to me 20 years ago, that the system we built cannot sustain itself once people stop performing their assigned roles. Enslaved people are walking away from plantations, refusing to work, demanding wages and freedom. The Confederacy calls this rebellion. I call it honesty. They have stopped pretending, just as Isaac stopped pretending, and without that pretense the whole edifice collapses. I freed Isaac to save myself. Now the whole South must free everyone to save whatever remains of our civilization. I suspect we will resist this truth as long as possible, just as I resisted it until I had no choice. And I suspect that resistance will cost us everything, just as it nearly cost me my life. The isolation shed where Isaac spent his final weeks at Belmonte still stands, now part of a preserved historic site operated by the National Park Service. Visitors can walk through it, can see the bare dirt floor and windowless walls, and imagine what it meant to be locked in darkness for weeks simply because your silence frightened people. Tour guides tell sanitized versions of the story, talking about the unusual slave who troubled his masters, without exploring what that trouble actually meant. They mention the fear Isaac generated, the 3 deaths associated with his ownership, the eventual manumission, but they frame it as a curious historical footnote rather than an indictment of slavery's psychological machinery. But the question remains, the same question that haunted Yancey until his death. Was Isaac dangerous? Or did he simply show people the danger they already carried within themselves? Did he cause 3 deaths and nearly a 4th? Or did he merely reflect back the fear and paranoia that slavery created in everyone it touched? Was his silence a weapon, or was it simply honesty in a system built on lies? The Charleston Constabulary never answered that question. Neither did the courts, the newspapers, or the historians who later studied the case. Maybe there is no answer. Maybe that's the point. Maybe Isaac's greatest act was asking a question that couldn't be answered without admitting truths that antebellum society couldn't afford to acknowledge. That slavery made monsters of masters. That fear was the foundation of the whole system. That the performances enslaved people were forced to give were the only things preventing owners from seeing themselves clearly. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is the one who refuses to pretend everything is normal. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Isaac caused the fears he encountered, or were people simply confronting their own darkness? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries that reveal uncomfortable truths, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves stories that make us question what we think we know. See you in the next video.